So this is the verbal consent part of the pre-interview, if you will. This interview will be is part of the African Digital Ethnography Project. It's known as ADEPT. The originator of the project and principal investigator is Dr. Aaron Carter Enyi, who is a professor of music at Morehouse College, a colleague of mine. I am a research professor on the project, and you can at any time reach out to either one of us if you have questions about the interview, if you have second thoughts about portions that you don't want to be made public. And after this interview, we will send you a raw file that's really not, for you to circulate, but just for you to review and see, again, if there's anything that you wanted removed before it becomes public. Because once the interview is made public, it will be placed on the Atlanta University Center's digital archive commons, which are fully accessible to anyone who has internet. This part of the project is focused on Black Americans, that is those who are descended from the slavery and Jim Crow experience in the United States, Muslims who have experienced schooling abroad prior to age 25, and I will be conducting this interview with you with your consent. Do I have your consent?
Yes, you have my consent.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. And now for questions of a basic logistics nature. So these will be questions where I'm going to ask you to tell me about your educational experiences abroad while growing up, particularly those related to Islamic schools and or schools in majority Muslim settings. The first question is, during what years did you attend school abroad? Like 96 to 2000 or something like that?
1998 to 2012.
Okay. And how old were you at the time, and which countries were you in?
1998, I went to Morocco.
At what age?
At the age of 12. I stayed there until 2000. And then I went to Syria. Stayed there to 2005, and then moved to Yemen and stayed there till about, I think, 2007. And then went to Egypt, stayed there till 2012.
And at any point or consistently were you with your parents or another sort of guardian, family, friend?
What do you mean by with? Like living with?
I guess in at least maybe in the same neighborhood with, perhaps.
So between the years of 2002, 1 or 2, and 2005, my father and brother lived in Syria, but I didn't live with them.
Okay.
I lived, I was in a dorm and then in my own apartment and so on and so forth. So, but they were there.
And you were all in Damascus?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, it wasn't even to 2005. I believe it might have been to 2003. So 2001 or 2 to 2003, they were there.
That's when they were in.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't stay till 2005.
Oh. But Salah attended classes?
He did. He went to he attended classes for a couple years.
Yep, I'll be interviewing you too.
Yep.
I'll do that. And in what parts of each country were you attending school? Because I know sometimes you might visit other parts of the country, but I want to know the parts that you were actually attending school. In Morocco, I was in Tangier. In Syria, I was in Damascus. And I also studied in Aleppo privately with some scholars privately there. Okay.
And in Yemen, I was in Tarim, and in Egypt, I was in Cairo.
So those are the basic questions. Okay. And now, with that setting, that backdrop, A set of questions about race, ethnicity, race-ethnic relations, religion, and identity. This question in sociological terms would be, what was the hidden curriculum
Okay.
in your schooling? And what I mean by that is sort of what did you learn beyond the explicitly intended curriculum? So for example, if you were learning Quran, which is memorizing how to recite Quran explicitly, what are the other things that you, if you reflect on, that you were learning while you were memorizing Quran or as you move through the advanced levels?
That's a pretty broad question. Well, beyond the formal curriculum, that's what you're saying. What other things? Learning in general, just any kind of learning.
And particularly, what kinds of things were you learning about different relations between racial groups, ethnic groups, and where you fit into that picture?
Okay. Well, each place was very different in that regard. So, I'll start, and maybe I'll talk about Morocco a little bit, at least, from my perspective, and then we'll have to break because the guy's ready for me to swipe the card. So, Morocco, well, I learned for the first time that obviously there's a difference between adults and kids. So I went at 12 years old. And I don't think I mentioned that in the first questions, but I went there when I was 12, and I went to Syria. I went to Morocco when I was 12, went to Syria when I was 15, 16, and then 20, 21 when I was in Yemen, and then the rest of the years, the 5 years after that was in Egypt. So I think I came back when I was 26, 27. In any case, so I was 12, and so I was socializing with people between 18 and, all the way down, to 7 or 8 years old, in the school. So so everything I'm talking about is within that context. So I learned, though, when I went there, that for the first time, that there were people in Africa who did not believe they were in Africa. They did not know that they were in Africa. They thought Africa was this kind of separate place from, from where they were. In any case, so that was mind blowing, in terms of. It just never occurred to me that people, would think that. So at least, anyway, so that was one thing. And then the distinction between African and Black, right? Me growing up, in the African American community in America, I just considered all Africans to be Black, even if you weren't Black in tone or dark skinned in tone or brown in tone. You're Black, So going there and realizing that no, we are white. And he would say we are white, and you are Black. I'm like, really? That's interesting. And then they had their own, the Rifis, the Susis, the Rifis, and and this is all in the language and in the understanding of that age group.
Susis and
so these are Berbers. These are Berber, the other ethnicities that spoke their own languages. And the Rifis were considered white, and the Susis were considered pretty much Black, even though they, according to our standards, they were all kind of Black or light skinned, that type of thing. All those distinct language-based distinctions and color-based distinctions, and they considered Africans being from sub-Saharan Africa. Black, really Black, like that was considered like sub-Saharan and like African proper. Everybody else was kind of like Arubis, for example, and that was a term that was used for like Arabs that had mixed with Africans in their history, and they spoke Arabic, but they were brown, which includes the king, and and his family and all of that, considered Arubis, right? So this was just mind blowing for me. I just, things were very black and white, when I came there. So that that was one thing. How I fit into that, again, that was, it was an evolving process because I had to get over the fact that I was, that Africans were being racist towards me, but then they weren't African, and going through that whole mental process. But then at the same time realizing that I was considered among the elite because I was American at the same time. I spoke English, and that was very, like, to talk about some double consciousness. So that was, there's like, really? So I had to, so how I fit into that was very complicated to me at the time. Being dark skinned, I got that element, or dark skinned compared to what they thought was black. that was I had that experience, while at the same time with the same people looking at me as superior because I'm American. So that was that was very, and then the whole Africa, not being in Africa, like they actually thought they were European. Some of them thought they were European, or they were kind of like sub-European, something like that, some in between state. Because the other thing I realized, which was very mind-blowing to me, was that there's Spanish cities in Africa you need passports to get into. So that to me, and they were Spanish, but they were in Morocco, it was Africa. So they weren't too far off of the truth. That was the problem. It was crazy. That Morocco was like a very deep end experience. As a first, but it prepared me for all the other countries I went to. So, so that was good. And I got to the point where I was indistinguishable from just a Moroccan because I was able to speak Darija very well at that time. I went there learning, not knowing anything. I didn't even know how to write. So I developed it in a very kind of, organic, natural way. So once I got to that stage, that was a whole different kind of, now I'm looked at as a Moroccan, I barely had an accent because, I went at 12. So I was still able to kind of pick it up in a very kind of, native way almost. I literally didn't speak English the entire time. The only time I spoke English was with my parents when they called once a week for an hour on Thursdays. So when I say I got to that, that was kind of like the context in which I developed that language. At least at that point, I don't speak like that now, but. So then I got that level of exposure where I'm I'm moving around like a Moroccan, and they wouldn't naturally assume. Towards the end of my stay there, no one would just assume I was American. I didn't dress like them. I didn't dress like Americans would dress. Had Moroccan clothes on, spoke, reading, studying Quran, and I knew all the areas. So I kind of got some more insight. And I realized it's not as racist as I thought it was initially, if I'm looking at it from a Moroccan perspective, I guess.
That's what I was going to ask. Did you ever at one point internalize a Moroccan perspective?
Right. To the extent that I guess I could, being from the perspective of someone who's being looked at like a Moroccan, and I kind of speak their language now, and I'm kind of just really fully integrated into the childhood kind of experience, the teenage experience. And so they treat me in a little different, I'm engaging with them on a different level now. So with them not knowing who I am, it's a little different. I realized, okay. And then from there, and then also as I got older, I was able to reflect on it more. It changed my perspective. I realized they weren't as bad as the racism wasn't as bad as I thought it was, even though it is from our perspective, So that was interesting.
Gotta go.
Yeah. But it'll only take about 15 minutes. Do you want to just resume after?